Well, good afternoon, folks. I want to welcome you back to the Chancellor Seminar Series. This is something that we've been doing over the past year as an effort to try and broaden the conversation about things that we in the university talk about a lot, but expand that conversation to some folks outside of the academy. I think today's presentation is one that a number of you are going to find extremely interesting from that perspective as well. I want to thank our sponsors for this event: Legacy Hospital, the Vancouver Business Journal, the Columbia River Economic Development Council, the Columbian, J.D. White, a division of Berger ABAM Engineering. They did that, I think, in part just so we give them a longer right. And the WSU Vancouver Office of Student Involvement. Did I mess up?
Sorry, I'm just going to kill that music.
Okay. Oh, all right. Okay, never mind. Most of the conversations that I have overheard or been involved with in the past several days, couple of weeks, month, have been ones around a sustainable or unsustainable economy. Okay. They're continuing, obviously. It sort of overshadows some concerns about sustainable other things. Okay. Brian Tissot is one of our faculty members who has been concerned about sustainable fisheries, shellfish as well as finfish, for quite some time, in fact, since he was in graduate school. Okay. He got his PhD in zoology from Oregon State University in 1991 and has served as a faculty member here at WSU Vancouver since 1998. His research focuses on the ecology and conservation of marine invertebrates and fishes. Okay. His projects investigate issues at the interface between conservation science, management, and policy. Okay. He has measured the decline of black abalone off the coast of California. Okay. The fish populations, particularly aquarium fish in Hawaii, and their decline and redevelopment there, as well as the bottom fish off of the coast of California and Oregon. His research has contributed to policies, federal policies or state policies about conservation and fishing regulations. And Brian himself has been actively involved in community organization, trying to help develop ways of opening up the conversation to additional groups to address some of these issues and ways in which they can be ameliorated or at least slowed down. Okay. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Brian Tissot. Brian, as some of you will notice, does not always look this way. Okay. He is always tan because his research allows him to spend an awful lot of time near the surf or under the surf with his wetsuit or in small little submarines as well, counting fish. But particularly since he came back from Hawaii, he has most often adopted a very different appearance, and he's here without his flip-flops today. So, Brian, welcome.
Everybody hear me okay? Hear me okay in the back? All right. Well, thank you very much, Hal, for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you all for coming. I'm very excited about what I have to share with you today about fisheries, but also about some of the things which I think are a lot more applicable to environmental issues in general, and particularly Southwest Washington. While I'm thanking people, I should also say that my research obviously involves lots of other folks, and I want to acknowledge them up front. Our work in Hawaii involves a large group of people that are working together doing research. Our work on the West Coast here with groundfish and trawl fisheries involves a huge number of people up and down the coast. I especially like to thank my graduate students who really are the ones that actually did most of the work. So, and a lot of them are here. So with that ado, this is what I plan to say, which I think is pretty simple. One, fisheries are in worldwide decline. I think a lot of you have heard about this. I'll briefly mention that. But two, and perhaps more important, we're learning through this process what works and what doesn't work. And as a piece of that, I want to give you an example from our work in Hawaii of a situation of what it worked and why it seems to be working well. However, other fisheries, an example here is an Oregon trawl fishery, has a lot of conflict among users around resources. And that's a very important part of fishery management, also something that's very challenging. But I think that lack of agreement around these conflicts is really what is driving or not allowing us to have sustainable fisheries. And I think that's a much more general message than just fisheries. And it's how do we overcome that? And to address that, I want to introduce you to a concept called integral ecology and use that not only to look at fishery issues, but also to bring it back here to Southwest Washington. And there are lessons here that I think are really important for resource management and I think for our communities in general. So that's where I plan to go. So first off, these are common headlines you've probably seen in the last 5 years or so, that fisheries are in crisis, they're global collapse, we are seeing threats to marine ecosystems, and even more importantly, there's closures of ground fish and more recently salmon, which have huge economic impacts because, of course, marine resources are a very important part of the Pacific Northwest. And this is really basically the message of the day around fisheries. Perhaps one of the most sobering studies was a study done by Boris Worm 2 years ago that showed that at our continual way we're managing fisheries, many of our worldwide fisheries would be gone in the next 30 years. And so I look at this as a wake-up call to, we need to think about how we're doing things and try and figure out how to do things better. So let me first look at why this is happening and then what we potentially could do about it. And interestingly, fisheries are based on a very simplistic model, and it's quite simple, and that's the concept of maximum sustainable yield. And this is really the holy grail of fisheries and has been for over 100 years. And the idea is simply this, is that you fish more often. That is, as you bring in more boats and more people and catch more fish, the amount of your catch goes up. And that's because as you fish down a population, it frees up resources for some of the fish, and they grow faster, and the population grows faster, so you catch more up to a point. At some point, then, the populations get too small, they start to decline in growth rate, and eventually you can fish them down by having too much effort, and if you ultimately overdo that, you can pretty much collapse an ecosystem. So what that means, though, at some optimal level, which is a certain amount of effort, you can get a maximum level of catch, and this is called the maximum sustainable yield. This is the major way we've managed fisheries for the last 100 years. It certainly isn't the only way. But this is also one of the reasons why fisheries are collapsing. There's a lot of problems with this model. Two in particular. One, it's very difficult in practice to estimate maximum sustainable yield. Populations change from year to year. We have climate change. We have El Nino. We have good and bad years. And so we have shifting population growth. And probably more importantly, there's a lot of pressures on fisheries, particularly economic pressure. So fishing is an industry. People have bills to pay, and there's this conflict between biological maximum sustainable yield and economic maximum sustainable yield. Secondly, fishing doesn't just catch fish. It also can cause damage to the bottom, and I'll talk about that, and destroy habitat. And that reduces the resilience of these ecosystems to respond and to recover and to actually sustain the yields that they should be yielding. And so I want to take a look at that as well. A third reason is this is how fisheries are managed, federal fisheries, which is the bulk of our commercial fisheries off the coast. They're managed through regional fishery management councils. And we are fortunate to have one right here in Portland. Each one of these councils is responsible for the fisheries in their area. These fisheries are basically a group of stakeholders, fishermen, processors, tackle shops, representative, including both science, government individuals, as well as citizens at large. And collectively, they take in scientific information. They make recommendations about management plans to the federal government, which usually adopts those. And this is a great way to do it, with the exception that, obviously, these committees tend to be dominated by fishermen, and economic interests often push fisheries continually. And with the lack of perfect information, we often result in failed fisheries. And so this is really federal policy and the way fisheries are done. What I want to do is give you some examples of fisheries that might work in other ways. And so we know some that work. And these are some of the main ones. Originally, traditional fisheries in native cultures actually were quite sustainable. And this is because these were based on literally centuries of trial and error. And particularly in the Pacific, they were based on what's called land tenure, and that is, or reef tenure. The people that lived there literally owned the resources, although they didn't think about it like that. They thought of it being stewards. They were taking care of it. And that rights to fishing, to access, was controlled by their family or their clan or their chief. And this is really important because if you take care of your resources, you get lots of fish. If you don't, you're going to pay the consequences. So it's in your best interest to manage wisely. And of course, this is what they learned over time, especially on islands with limited resources, that they must use a wise stewardship to do so. There are modern analogs of this. One of the more interesting ones are the lobster gangs in New England and how they control access to their lobster fishery. Not particularly legal, but it works in that it keeps people out of the fishery, and they largely control that kind of catch. Fishery cooperatives are another example of successful fisheries. This is groups of people that come together that have shares that largely control access to fish, because they obviously have an incentive to keep the fishery sustainable. Community-based management is something I'm going to talk about, which is really important. And that is because what it does is allows the community to have a stake. And again, in theory, you should have, you should be very careful about your resources. And then lastly, I want to mention something that's also a very common method of resource management in the ocean, and that is marine protected areas. And it's a different concept in the idea that if you close off a certain percentage of the coastline to fishing, that population can build up and potentially sustain the areas outside. It's like having fish in the bank, and you're only living off of the interest. And that's also a very important tool I'd like to talk about. So let me give you first an example of Hawaii, or a fishery that works. I'll bring it back to the West Coast, look at one that's very challenging right now, and see if we can learn something from that. So the work I did in Hawaii before coming to WSU was largely focused around the aquarium fishery. This is where they go off on the reef and they live catch fish, which are then exported to the aquarium industry. And over about 20 years, this industry developed a very strong conflict with the dive tour industry. If any of you have ever been out to Hawaii, one of the big things you do is go out on a boat and go down underwater and see fish. So this is one group that takes the goods off the reef, the other ones that just capitalizes on the services. And over time, as both of these industries grew, they developed a clash. So this is a classic resource conflict over what became limited resources. And so here's an example of how this was caricatured in the Washington Post. And here it is, basically, it might have been a scene in a dusty western, but instead they were having a shootout over fish. And this is actually true. There were some very heated and pointed clashes between fishermen and non-fishermen on the coast of Hawaii. Nobody was killed that I know about, but it kind of gives you an idea of the level of conflict that occurred. And so I began, with a number of colleagues, involved in this over 15 years ago. And what we did, and this is an important role of science, is, well, how big are these impacts? And so we did research to basically figure out how many fish were getting impacted, and in some cases more than 50%. And then more importantly, or equally important, we turned around and we told the community what we found, and we told the legislature what we found. And now they had information that they didn't have about this conflict, and they acted, which was very interesting. And one of the results of that information and a lot of lobbying by the community and other action groups was to pass a law, in this case called Act 306. What it did was create what's called a regional fishery management area for the entire West Hawaii coastline, the west coast of the Big Island, with a certain mandate in that area. And one of those was to create at least 30% of the areas closed to aquarium fishing and put those in marine protected areas, protect some of the resource. Secondly, they had to involve the community in that effort so that people could have a say about those resources. And third, we had to have a scientific evaluation of whether that actually did anything, whether the resource changed. Those are really important ingredients for sustainable fisheries. And so that's where I got involved, is also in the second part was actually working on the effect of this. And so once we got a proposal for where they were going to put these marine protected areas, they had a public meeting about this. And to give you an idea of how heated and how polarized this was, there was testimony there. Over 1,000 people showed up, and this is in Kona, which is not a very big community. It was the largest public meeting on a natural resource issue ever in the Hawaiian Islands. And astoundingly, 93% of the people there supported marine protected areas. Now remember that number, because when I come back to Oregon, you'll see it's a very different situation. But it's, it was quite a meeting. And ultimately what happened was then these marine protected areas were established, and we began studying those. And so on the west coast of the Big Island, there are now 9 marine protected areas that are closed to fishing. And myself and my colleagues and graduate students have been surveying these since 1999. And literally what we do, initially 6 times a year, now 4 times a year, go down and count fish in these areas and invertebrates and corals and make sure these things are not only healthy, but how they're changing over time in response to now having no people accessing those. And it's been really a one-of-a-kind study. And what we have found so far is the following. First of all, if you're going to look at how fish change over time, you have to have something to compare it to. So what we compared it to is what we call a reference site. These are places that are already in marine parks and have been not impacted by people for over 10 years before we started. And so what I'm going to show you is the abundance of the primary aquarium fish in West Hawaii, which is the yellow tang. If you go into most tropical reef aquarium marine shops and look, you'll see these little yellow fish. They're an icon of the aquarium industry, and they're 80% of the catch in West Hawaii. And so if we went on the reef and counted these, this is a number of fish in about 100 square meter, which is just a quarter of the room here, and how it changed over time. And this is the mean number of fish, and this is the variability of that. And so this was 1999, before the marine reserves were actually closed. And then they were closed here, and they've been closed all along this time. So this is up until 2006. And so this is an area that this is displaying is natural variability. This place has been closed before this and all the way through this. So this gives you a reference to compare to. And notice the fish have increased over time, but not tremendously. There's a lot of variability. But interestingly, this is what happened to the marine protected areas. So these are the ones we've been studying. When we first began studying in 1999, when they were still open to fishing, notice the difference here. There's about twice as many fish in these reference areas. But over time, once they were closed, even though it took a few years, eventually they started replenishing when new fish came into the area, new reproduction. And then literally after 4 or 5 years, they were no different from these now reference areas. In other words, these marine protected areas work. They replenished fish. They increased them over 50% in the entire network. And in some places, they were increased by 2 or 3-fold. And so this was an effective management strategy that worked quite well. And even perhaps equally important is the aquarium fishery itself is live and well. Even though 30% of the coast was closed to the fishery, if you look at that in terms of their sustainability up to that line is when the fishery was closed, and it continued to increase in terms of the value of the catch, the overall number of fish they caught, and the actual catch per unit effort. All of these things are measures of fishery success. And so not only were the ecology working, was there more fish for the people to look at, but there was more fish for people to catch. And so this is a good example of a sustainable fishery. And so why? Why did this work, and what can we learn from that? Well, there's a couple of lessons here that I think are really important. We'll see might be missing from some other examples. One of which is there was a mandate from the state to do something. The government was involved. That's really important. But you don't want only government, because top-down approaches are simply not effective. In this case, we also had substantial involvement of the community, and together, working together, they co-manage the resource, which is a model for very effective management. Equally important, science plays a very strong role, and that information really helped guide the project and helped us develop where we needed to go, and also confirm that things were actually working. Also, there was a long history of involvement in the community and education, and that is key. To get 1,000 people to turn out and to support it, people had to understand these things. And so that was traditional education, K-12, universities, extension and outreach, and a lot of informal education as well. This was key to getting people to rally around the idea and support it. And we also involved the fishermen in the decisions. They weren't just a target. They were part of that process. And there was a council that was developed which made these decisions, and that allowed people to resolve some of their disputes. And so all of these things tended to work together. It's not a perfect example. I'm just showing you some of the general results, but it's actually worked quite well. Let me now turn to fisheries on our coast and give you an idea of how things are going here. And I think you'll see that the contrast is quite stark. So Pacific Northwest marine fisheries, and this is largely fisheries in the ocean, not typically salmon, which is often in rivers and streams, although there's certainly an ocean fishery. It's a greater than $500 million industry, or it used to be. It's largely composed off of our coast of ground fish, things that are near the bottom fish, rockfish, rock cod, halibut, sole, black cod, or sablefish. These are typical kinds of things that you get in markets. And the principal mechanism by which they're caught is bottom trawling. And that is they drag a net along the bottom and catch lots of fish, a very effective way to fish. And so to give you an idea of how this works, and I'll show you some videos here in a second, here's a boat dragging this on the bottom, big trawler boats. And this is give you an idea of the intensity of bottom trawling off of the Oregon coast, which is the largest trawling fleet in the United States at the moment. And so literally you can see there's not very many places that haven't been trawled. It's a very intensive effort. And of course, this is very effective, and they catch a lot of fish. One of the things that's important here is most people, I mean just about everybody, but the trawlers themselves, you don't see what's going on underwater. All you see is what comes up. And so a big part of our research, a lot of people's research, is to go underwater and look at this up close and personal and get an idea of what's really happening. Remember, one of the main issues is impacts to the bottom, which are largely unknown. And so this gives you an idea of what trawling is like. This is a video from Norway, I believe. And so what they're doing is dragging the net on the bottom. There's an upper part of the net here. Fish are kind of scooped up and go over that net into the back of the net. But you see other things here are getting pushed around and cut off. Some of these are long-lived invertebrates like corals, which I'll come back to that. But also you're catching pretty much everything that's there. And it's very effective, but you don't always get what you want. So there's two things that are consequences of this. One is called bycatch, the things that you didn't target. And two is how it impacts the habitat on the bottom. And I think you've seen, particularly with some of these rocks and boulders here, but more importantly, this one shot, you'll see probably a very old coral getting mowed down in the process, right there. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, one of them is bycatch. This is a picture just a couple of years ago of basically an overfished species, widow rockfish, that had a very small quota that just happened to be caught by mistake when they were fishing for something else. And what they did, of course, was they dumped them overboard because they don't need them. And not only that, if they brought them back, they wouldn't be able to fish for the rest of the season. It's a real problem for fishing, and it's a challenge for fishermen because these nets are not that specific. And of course, this is really bad for the ecosystem because you're catching fish that you didn't necessarily target. Also, that bycatch, in addition to catching lots of other untargeted fish, you get lots of invertebrates, things that live on the bottom. And a big part of our research is that invertebrates are not just animals down there, they're part of the habitat in which fish live. And so you're not just catching fish, you're also potentially damaging the bottom. The extent to which that's true, we don't really understand. So that's a big part of what our research is, to go underwater and to look. And to give you an idea of how these things really look, they're absolutely stunning. Here's a picture from Southern California of a black coral. This is about 15 feet high, probably at least 100 years old. And you don't really appreciate these things until you're underwater. But clearly, at least for this individual, these fish, this is a part of what they're living on. They're hanging out there. And so if you damage something like this coral, you have a potentially large impact on the fish themselves. And this does not contribute to sustainability. So a big part of our work is figuring out to what extent this is true, what species are important, where they live, and being able to protect areas like this, which don't make sense to fish, relative to other areas which might. And so as a result, this is what we've got on the West Coast. This is a diagram of the abundance of the major commercial ground fish from what we think was basically unfished stock all the way up until the year 2000. And this is a result of a lot of things, overfishing, climate change, damage to the bottom. There's so many things going on here, it's hard to say. But overfishing is certainly the major choice. And it got to a point where it was so bad, once species stocks get to below 20% of their original biomass, they must be closed and rebuilt. And you might have heard about this in the early part, about 6 years ago. They were developing rebuilding plans for all those fishes. There was closures for ground fish, and they have been coming back to some extent. So what's going on? Well, this is a part of what we've been doing. Instead of being on the surface, we go out on ships like this, and we get in submersibles, little tiny things that are really fun but not very big, and we go down underwater and we actually look at the bottom. And this gives us the chance to actually firsthand see what's happening down there, to look at impacts, but more importantly, to count the fish, count the invertebrates, get direct, it's like looking at normal ecosystems, right? Which you do with all terrestrial systems. But in this case, you actually get a firsthand view of what it looks like. And so here's what we found in one study we just did off of Oregon. And so this is a picture of two different places. One, an untrawled normal habitat. What you're looking at are called sea pens. Sea pens are corals. They're cold water corals. They're about this high. They grow about 10 centimeters a decade. So these are about half a meter high. They're probably 40 to 50 years old at least. And they're kind of like mini forests on the muddy bottom. But the muddy bottom, unfortunately, is an area that's heavily trawled. And this is what a trawled area looks like. A lot more barren. Obviously, there's no sea pens. They can't handle this kind of destruction. You saw some of that. And it's a very different community. And, we've known this, but the extent to which there are differences were largely known. And so working with a colleague of mine, Mark Hickson at Oregon State University, we did a study off of Coquille Bank in Oregon, and this is what we found. And that is that obviously trawling, if you compare an untrawled area to the number of fish, and this is a hectare, which is about 2 or 3 acres, there's quite a lot of fish in untrawled areas, and it's reduced in trawled areas, but not hugely, but it is significantly reduced. And it's also very different kinds of fish. So trawling itself, in terms of fishing, if you don't do it too much, they can come back. But the problem with that is, look at the difference between the invertebrates, which are primarily sea pens here. The number per hectare here was in the order of 18,000, very, very abundant, but huge impacts due to trawling. And these things do not come back very quickly or at all. And not only is that bad, but it's habitat. And so it has a potential impact to the ecosystem, which sustains the fish and obviously slows things down. And so this is a study that got a lot of press, and it was very widely circulated. But studies like this, a lot of which were conducted on our coast, were really important and eventually fed into the federal government. And these are fisheries which are 3 miles offshore out to 200 miles. And so several years ago, as a result of things like this, they created what are called fish habitat reserves. And there's a whole series of areas that are closed now to bottom trawling off of our coast, which are areas that are designated as sensitive habitat because they have lots of corals, or they're very rocky, or they're certain depths, but they're, a lot of this has been defined through research. And so now we can still trawl, and when they do, in a lot of these other areas, but this way they can protect the sensitive habitats, and hopefully that creates sustainable fisheries. What I want to talk about next is now, this was federal reserves, what happens to in-state waters. So in the state of Oregon now, which is from the shore out to 3 miles, they're going through a similar process to develop marine protected areas. And this is more important for recreational fisheries than anything else, people that go out on party boats, things like that. And it's a very different world, one of which, and this is a context for maybe what we need to do better, is this is an area that has a long regulatory history. It has a history of constantly changing regulations. So the people that fish a lot have to deal with huge shifts in how they do business. Secondly, there's been a lot of recent closures which have impacted fisheries. There's been closure recently of salmon that puts entire industries out for years, And previously there was groundfish closures in certain areas and depths. These are severe hardships for fishing and coastal communities. But this is a backdrop for this process. Also, the idea of lots of issues coming in. Oregon is not just dealing with closed fisheries. It's dealing with ocean energy, which is a huge issue coming in, liquid natural gas terminals, as well as other things. And so this community is being besieged with lots of things all at once. And it's not a good recipe for making sound decisions or engaging the community. And more importantly, when they announced the Marine Protected Area Initiative, and this was a top-down effort from the governor, Kulongoski, and he basically said this last fall. They began a public process in February. Proposals were just due last month, and they're going to designate these things next year. I mean, that's an extremely fast process. again, for communities that have a lot of things going on. And so you can almost guess what would be happening there. And so here's a little few of the headlines. This is very different than Hawaii. So obviously, fishermen and the fishing communities do not like this idea. Some of the other ones that you see are skeptical reactions. And this is all putting it mildly for people that have been to some of these meetings. Things like, you're putting the cart before the horse. This is ridiculous. Things like that. So why is this so different than Hawaii? What's going on here that we haven't learned in other places? So I kind of want to digress into an area what I call integral ecology, which is not something I invented, but I think it's a useful way to looking at these kinds of issues and other ones. And hopefully this is, for most of you, will be very new. And so the epiphany I had from this is, what is sustainability, and how can we make fisheries sustainable, or resources in general? And one of which, as a scientist, was pretty interesting, is that, we're not managing fish here. Not like forest management. We're not doing anything to the fish. What we're managing is people. We're keeping them away and letting them do certain things. And as a scientist, that's kind of like, wow, I'm dealing with people, And of course, I do. I just wasn't doing it consciously, That's really not why I went into science. But I'm there now. And I think more importantly, we have certainly not all the science. There's so much we don't know. But we have enough to make these kinds of choices and to make fisheries a lot better than they are. What really is the problem is that we can't agree together as a communities on what we need to do about this. And to me, that's the block for sustainability right there. We have what we need, but we just have to come together about this. And so this is kind of the second part of my talk, and you've seen this title as too. What is sustainability, and how can we get there? So let me introduce you to integral ecology, which is not really a new idea. But first of all, how do we get to sustainability? What is it? I mean, most people think it's this kind of, golden destination at the end, but you have to go through this maze, right? And you're asking these questions like, what kind of information do we need? We have to pass new laws, green laws, tax people differently, change the way they think. What do we need to do to get to that holy land at the end where we can all be happy and have sustainable government, communities, economics, things like that? Well, what I think is going on is quite different, and I like to think about sustainability different. That the sustainability isn't a destination, it's the maze itself. In other words, what sustainability is, it's an adaptive process. You never really get there. It's something that you do that is what sustainability is about. In other words, it's a construct that defines our path to the future. Sustainability is our path to the future. It's just, how do we get there? What do we need to do differently? And in the process of doing that, are we being sustainable in the way we act every day? And so I believe a really important part of this is mutual agreement, that we all agree these are the paths we want to take, these are the things we need to do. If we can do that, I think that really defines what sustainability is, or at least a major part of it. Because a lot of it we already have. And so let me digress a little bit to, quite a bit I should say, to integral ecology. Because these are not new ideas, really. If you go back to the philosophy of Plato, he was talking about these ideas, over 2,000 years ago. And one of his ideas about value systems was that there are three: the good, the beautiful, and the true. And they're pretty simple, really, in the sense that the true was, nature, truth in nature. That nature has its own laws, and those are true. All we need to do is understand those, and they can guide us through life. The beautiful is our own experience, our joy, our things that we do in life. But the good, which is one of his highest aspirations, was justice, that we have government that respects individual rights. And of course, this is the foundation of our modern democracy. But what he's really talking about here is the different perspectives you can have in the way we approach problems and study problems. And so this was articulated quite a bit later, but relatively recently, by a man called Ken Wilber, who's a philosopher as well, very smart. And what he said is, what Plato's really talking about here is this, what we call this 4-quadrant model. And that is, you can divide the world into exteriors and interiors. Now, exteriors are things that we can see. Things like people, things like dollars, trees. They're empirical forms, things that are the domain of science and engineering and political systems and economics, but they're exterior things. Interiors are things we can't see, but we can experience them. We can discuss them, their joy, their sadness, their shared belief systems, morals, things like that. And more importantly, these interiors and exteriors can be divided into what we individually see or do versus what we collectively see or do. And so in a simplistic way of looking at this, there's 4 different ways of seeing the world. That is, what I do, what's my behavior or yours, what we do as a group, what I experience or you experience, and then what we experience jointly. What are our collective experiences, our beliefs, our worldviews? All of these are different perceptions of the same thing. They're not apart, they're all integrated. And so this is a tool in which to look at the world in a different way. And one way to think about this is that it's nothing new, really. If you look at a modern university, we have all of these things. The domain of kind of the individual exteriors, biology, chemistry, physics, and other fields, systems or ecology, economics, political science, lots of other things, our collective worldviews, anthropology, sociology, religious studies. These are looking at morals and belief systems. And of course, the joys, the experiences we have, the arts, psychology of the mind, spirituality. These are all different things that we study, right? So one of the things about this model is it helps you look at the world in an interdisciplinary way and see how things are working or not working based on that premise. And so another way to think of it, which I think is easier, is there's 4 windows on the world. And you can look at each one of them, or you can try to look at all of them at once and see what that tells you. So with that kind of an idea, let's go back to Oregon and see how that works. And so one of the things that happened in February of this last year was a public process. In fact, people are getting so angry that Sea Grant Extension, which is what they do extension, a very important part of education out to the community, and had workshops about marine protected areas. And so me and a couple of my students, we attended a few of these, and there was a total of 9 public hearings, 555 participants. You could submit your comments on cards, or you could speak them at the meeting, which was done quite as well. And the major groups I wanted to look at here, and this is, of course, simplistic, was there were fishermen, there were conservationists, which are very pro-MPA, scientists were there, and then, of course, just citizens. And I want to look at this from an integral perspective. What were people doing? What were they thinking? What were they experiencing? And so what I did is we went to some of these meetings, but they're also summarized all online, and just looked at the comments people made. And then based on their comments, what are they saying? They're saying, I'm angry, or I like this, or we should do this, and try and place those in the quadrants. And what I'm going to indicate here is first the range of responses, if they were in all quadrants or some. And again, this is kind of the majority of the comments. And then where the major focus of that group was, in one quadrant or the others. And so first of all, the scientists. These are typical comments you get from scientists at these meetings. It's all about science, right? Which is what you'd expect, and it should be. But if you really think about that, it's pretty much all in the systems quadrant. This is science. These are ecosystems. This is works. This can help fisheries economically. It's about what we do. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a big part of what all of us do is systems. But it's not obviously all-inclusive. If you look at conservationists, they have a very different focus. Their focus is on changing behavior. They want to get to the roots of the problem, and that is people eating too much fish, or fishermen doing certain things, or like that. So their focus is not quite as broad. I mean, it's broader. It encompasses more things, but they're really focusing on changing individual behavior, either by incentives or regulations or getting people to eat seafood that's marked from healthy fisheries, things like that, which makes sense. But notice they're very different than what scientists are doing. And citizens, have all sorts of comments, some of which are quite mixed. And you'd expect the citizenry is very diverse. And so they were everywhere. But again, most of the comments were really about systems, economics, some about the science. What's interesting is fishermen. They have very different responses. And based on the history of what I told you, you can understand why. Leave the fishing alone. They're very concerned about their jobs. These are, for the most part, if you think about it, although they're all over the board, this is about how I feel about this, right? This is not about embracing marine protected areas. This is saying, leave us alone. There are personal attacks sometimes because their livelihood's being threatened, or basically saying things about science that aren't necessarily flattering, which can be true to some extent, but very different. And here's my point about all this, is that these are all in different places for the most part. And this is really not mutual agreement. And I think this is part of the problem. People are coming to this from very different perspectives, and they're saying different things. And I don't get the feeling that people are really listening to each other. And they're missing a lot of the boats. And so this is my point, is how can you have an objective discussion about something like marine protected areas when you're all coming from different subjective angles? And I know we can do this, it's just doing it consciously, that where we're taking those kinds of viewpoints into consideration. And I think this is one of the problems with these kinds of issues, is being able to deal with that. So to kind of bring this home, last year in my environmental assessment class here on campus, I said, well, let's see how Southwest Washington is doing. And so I had an assignment, a part of the class, where we went out. There was about 40 students, and they were asked to attend public meetings in Southwest Washington or Portland, and basically go there, make observations on who facilitated, what the objectives, whether they're met or not, who the stakeholders were, kind of do the similar kind of analysis. And so these are the meetings they all went to, and there was a lot of meetings going on all the time. And that's an issue in itself when you think about people trying to engage in a lot of things, a lot of complex things going on. And here's what they found. First of all, who facilitated the meeting? And this is an important point. For the most part, primarily it was government. And of course, a lot of these were government meetings. In some cases, it was scientists and engineers. Only rarely was it actually somebody that was not really affiliated with these groups leading that. And that can be an issue because people have their own value systems, and they come at it from a certain perspective. And if you're leading that with your perspective, you're not necessarily, listening to all the value systems or embracing that as much as you could. And so obviously, one recommendation from this is to have an independent facilitator as much as possible. I mean, some of these meetings were city or county government, so it doesn't necessarily make sense. But if you really want to get an objective feedback from people or their subjective opinions, that might be something to consider. Other comments were, a lot of these meetings were really small. Not a lot of people would come. Some of them were just listening to presentations forever, and that was important because there was a lot of information, but when you only have an hour or two at night after work, that does constrain public input. But also, it's very fast. Decisions were being made within weeks or months, and again, these were comments that people got from observing these meetings. And but for the most part, the meetings actually did pretty well, and most of the students felt they all met their objectives. Perhaps more interestingly is the kind of integral analysis of this. If you look at the people that presented material, even though the majority of the comments were in the systems, look, there was basically people discussing all of these things, all of these perspectives. And this is really good. It means these meetings in general were listening to people. They were listening to how people felt. They're listening to how they feel. They were thinking about their individual behavior. So there was a lot of acknowledgement of cultural issues and personal issues and things like that, and individual behavior. And that's very different than some of these other situations. And if you look at the audience, it's not too different from that. Again, their main focus was about economy, politics, science, things like that. But there was a little bit more about how we feel than there might have been with the meetings, which is kind of makes sense, right? So in other words, based on this, Clark County seems to be doing quite well. But obviously there's things to learn here which might help. And one of those things is what's called integral dynamics. And that's where you can take the kind of comments from these meetings and look at those and think about solutions. So for example, if you think about the worldview issue or culture, some of those are, how do we feel about communication? Well, a lot of comments were, there's too much information here. We can't digest this. And that's not a positive thing. It's a negative thing that in this area. So what you think about is ways you can offset that and to kind of bring people back into the fold. And one of those is, to get people talking themselves. And that way you can help solve this. If this is a bottleneck, you'd want to identify some of the key ones and move forward. By the same token, you can do it, how are people experiencing? And one of the things that's not uncommon is a mistrust of government. That came through quite a bit. Some people just don't trust the government. And right now you can understand even more, right? And so to bring people back into that, what you try to do is get them to feel, this is their home. We live here. We're doing this for you. How can you change that to where people have a sense of place, where they're happy with where they live, and engage them in a way that's meaningful? And I think all of these meeting people tried to do that, and very well. But the idea is, this is something you could improve. Think about more how to do it better. And I think that's the value of this kind of thinking. It's very holistic, but really not all that different than what we already do. It's just a way of doing it consciously. And so in closing, what are the keys to sustainability? And I've been very much influenced by this one book, which I didn't really think about until last night when I was trying to figure out what I was going to say at the end. And this is a book by Kai Lee called Compass and Gyroscope. And Kai Lee was a member of the Northwest Power Planning Council for a number of years. And what he wrote about was how do you balance power issues in the Northwest with public interests and perception. And his book is really brilliant because what he talks about, which makes sense to me in the context of what I just mentioned, that there's two really important pieces here, and compass and gyroscope, neither of which by themselves works. The compass is science and engineering and technology. This gives us a solution that points us in the right direction. This is the way we need to go. But if you just know which way you need to go, you're not going to get anywhere per se, because you don't know when to stop or what to do, right? But it's an important piece of getting somewhere. The piece that overcomes that is a gyroscope, and that's the public process. It spins. It can be a little random, but it has a lot of inertia. It doesn't move very fast. And so together, if you have a gyroscope which knows where to go, it can be a very effective way. But his point is we need to do this adaptively. It's an adaptive management solution. We don't know how to get to sustainability. We just have to feel our way there. We have to learn as we go. And we need science, we need technology, but very importantly, we need a healthy public process. And so these things work together. And so a part of that is what I'd like to end with. These are my recommendations based on what I've learned, which I think are more general, but certainly for resource management. What we need to make these things work, obviously, is science, but for healthy communities, we need what I would call resilient communities. And this is an ecosystem concept. That is, an intact ecosystem is resilient. It can resist change. It knows how to, it has redundancies in it. And so if we have resilient communities, we have communities that can respond to what's coming. Because if anything constant about what the future holds is change. And so that's something we need to know, we need to expect. And I think these are attributes of resilient communities. Certainly not all of them, but some of them. We certainly need a well-educated citizenry, and that's very important. Both formal education, K-12, colleges, universities, but also extension and outreach. But informal, museums, aquariums, zoos, parks, these all working together are a very important piece of getting people educated and getting the issues out to them. Diverse social networking, that's really key. There's lots of people talking to lots of other people, and they cross all sorts of boundaries and lines. And I think, of course, that's one of the reasons Hal did this, is to bring people together with the university. We also need an engaged, well-coordinated government. People working together, city, county, state, federal, engaged in resource management and other issues, but working well with each other as well. That's key. And then finally, I think, certainly with some issues, the community has to be involved at levels. Things like watershed stewards, people that are engaged in issues and are working, hopefully with community support, with government support, to feel like they own the resources, because obviously it is a big part of our life and it affects us directly. And so getting involved is really key. So I would end with this last slide, and I guess my point is I think we're really lucky to live in the Northwest. We have a lot of great things going on. We have a lot of great people. We have everything we need to solve almost all of these problems. We just need to do it better. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Benefit of CVTV, I've got a microphone here that we'd like you to use for that purpose. Anybody?
Have you done any studies up in Puget Sound with regard to the oxygen levels up there, with regard to the sea life in specifically Hood Canal and that area?
No, I haven't.
You haven't? Are you familiar with the problems that they're having up there?
Yeah, I've read about them, and the dead zones off of Oregon, they're very similar, sure.
And have you done studies in the dead zones off of Oregon? Or?
I have not, no.
Okay.
I know colleagues that are.
Okay.
You know, and that's a huge issue, and it was not completely understood, but you know, there's a pretty good indication a lot of this is linked to climate change and very changes systems and the dynamics. So those have huge impacts.
Thanks.
Anybody else? No?
In the Hawaii model, they designated 30% as protected. Is there a similar percentage that could be used off of the coast of Oregon for the various initiatives?
There is. What the governor has decided in Oregon is not to do anything like that. So the only thing he's done is limit it to 9 marine reserves. And so right now there are proposals are in. They're all available online if you go to Oregon Marine Reserve. And so based on which ones are actually accepted, they're being evaluated by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and eventually will go to the governor for approval. Based on that, you know, there will be a certain percentage closed. The last proposals I looked at had about 20% being closed.
Is that enough?
Well, it's hard to say. You know, I mean, it depends on what you protect, what are the habitats you protect, and how that's going to work. It's a minimal number, I'll say that. But you have to balance those kinds of things with the impacts that they incur. You close areas where people can't fish or, you know, other things. Obviously, that's not good. In the long run, it should benefit people, but you know, you have to be a little careful about that. So, and that's exactly what I think the process is doing, is trying to balance those conflicting needs.
Hi, Brian. Enjoyed that talk very much. I heard on a report not too long ago about some studies in fisheries management that come out recently about models that were trying to be based on not so much ownership, but trying to take that element that seemed to work, seemed like it worked in Hawaii, where when people feel they have a vested interest in a particular place or set of the system that's theirs, or that they have, you know, some connection to, that they protect it better.
Right.
And that there has been some modeling anyway, or some theoretical discussion about whether similar kinds of approaches could be used in fisheries management in other systems. Do you think that would apply in Oregon or in any of the systems that you've worked in?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is the article in Science about catch shares.
Yes.
And how that, right. And the idea is there's, you know, limited fishery and people get allocated certain amounts of that. And so they have ownership. And so if you're always going to be guaranteed a certain part of the catch, obviously you don't want to overfish and cause damage. And I think, you know, the conceptual part of that is very similar to these other different models, is the stewardship piece, the idea that you accrue benefits, but you also accrue cost. And so that's one way to do it. There are challenges to that, and I don't know whether that would work off of Oregon. I mean, one of the things you usually establish a limited entry fishery. That is, it closes at some point, and the only way somebody can come in if somebody leaves. And that's kind of, you know, that's, some people don't think that's a very fair system. And the other one is big businesses, once they get in there, sometimes they can buy up other shares, and so that can kind of take over the fishery. So with regulation, it can work. It's certainly one model. I don't know whether that would actually work in Oregon or not. You know, it seems like the fleet is, you know, there's a lot of people that have been doing this for generations, but there's also some relatively new people entering the fishery. So it's certainly one model to look at.
So I hear a lot about kind of restricting fishing areas and things like that. Is there any talk off of the West Coast about modifying fishing methods? So trawling versus long lining, things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, what's interesting is about 10 years ago when they started looking at trawling pretty intensively, it's an ancient technology. It's been around for over 100 years, and it hasn't changed much. And so it's only relatively recently that they've started looking at that and trying to modify that with different kinds of, you know, the size of wheels you have at the bottom and how they can roll over things. And certainly with GPS and more precise navigation, you can avoid areas that are impacted. So there is a lot of research going on that now. And that's where we get a lot of these videos, because that's the only way you can tell. You just go down there and you mount cameras and you watch, and then you see what you catch. And so it's a really important area, and the engineering of that is very special science. And but you know, it's not an area I think getting as much interest as it should, because I think their perception is, you know, fisheries are crashing. You know, it's not, you don't want to go into fishery as a work, as a career. But I think on the other hand, they're going to be around a long time, and it's a very important part of our Northwest heritage. So we just need to work to make them better, and that certainly would be an important piece of that.
Anybody else?
Maybe you could speak in the microphone. I can't. How are you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right.
As we look at new forms of alternative energy, do you have any experience of what that would do to the fish hatchery off the coast of Oregon with hydropower, or solar, not solar, wind turbines? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I don't know that much about wind turbines, things like that. One of the things I am a little bit familiar with is ocean energy, and that's what they're planning on putting on the Oregon coast. And some of these are buoys which are attached to the bottom, and as they go up and down, they generate electricity. And they've had some pilot projects out there, and they're planning on scaling up quite a large number of those. And clearly we need to do this. But there are impacts, and as there's some of the fishermen particularly, but also surfers and other people are really concerned about what these are going to do, because obviously these things have to be attached to the bottom, and so they can cause impacts to the bottom. They might, if you have lines going up through the water, boats can get hung up on this, whales can get run into these things. And so there are a lot of concerns, which I think we can hopefully, that are not huge, that you can minimize those and develop them in a way that are going to be sustainable in that sense too, because clearly that's endless energy for really low cost once you get it set up. So there's a lot of research going on there, but we just need to do that really carefully, and that's a brand new field right now, which I think is pretty exciting.
Let me get you.
How does aquaculture interface with this? Your studies?
Yeah, well, aquaculture is a really important part of of providing fish for people, and so a big part of what's happened. A lot of fisheries which have failed now are all completely aquaculture. Things like abalone, for example. A lot of the oyster fisheries are cultured, salmon fisheries, of course, and so they tend to be pretty good, but there's also impacts like that. I mean, I guess anything has some pros and cons. The pros, of course, it provides food, and that's can keep going for long periods of time. But these things do have impacts. So if they're done correctly, or at least a way to minimize damages, they can be quite useful. Of course, I think we all understand some of the issues with hatchery-related salmon and how that interacts with the salmon fishery. That's an example that we're learning to, I think, be very careful about. But it allows us to have a salmon fishery when normally we wouldn't, because all the wild stocks are listed on the Endangered Species Act. But the other one that's happening now is kind of offshore ranching, where they're actually developing pens out in the open ocean off the coast. And the federal government is very interested in expanding this, and I think we'll see that in the next 10 or 15 years. And that has great promise, but again, with wires and buoys and big storms, you wonder about the impacts of that. But hopefully we can study those and learn that they can be done relatively safely, because that's a way you can actually just harvest fish out of those things and not have a lot of impacts.
This is starting to sound like one of those public meetings, right?
Except these are all nice comments. I usually get yelled at.
Is evolution having an effect on the migratory salmon? I've been hearing that as an increasing number of salmon are spending an extra year in the reservoir before going to the ocean, and thus surviving coming back. A higher percentage of the fish are reported to be these stayovers, and I just wonder what you know about that, whether that's so or not.
Unfortunately, not a lot. I really don't know that much about salmon. There's a lot of people, and maybe some people here that do. I know there are some salmon that actually do stay in streams and rivers and don't really migrate, or they come back earlier, and there is changes happening in that regard. How significant they are, and to what extent that indicates they're actually evolving, I'm not sure. But certainly that's an important issue.
Do you think artificial reef systems have a place off the coast of Oregon and Washington?
Yeah, typically, artificial reefs are kind of places where there's kind of two trains of thought. One, if you don't have any habitat and you put them down, they can be useful because maybe they develop structure, which then, can bring fish in and, cause fishing to be enhanced in those areas. And there's some evidence that supports that. The other piece of evidence suggests when you put a bunch of cars or rocks and you build a reef, it doesn't really do anything but pull fish from somewhere else. And it actually concentrates fishermen, so it makes it easier for them to overfish. So, and there's a lot of argument and debate about this, and I think there's evidence for both. So I think one of the points is you just need to do it thoughtfully and carefully. So Oregon, I'm not sure you really want to do that. There's plenty of good reef areas, so it's not really an issue. Plus, I don't know if you think about the storms we've had last year in particular, where those NOAA buoys were blasted out. They probably wouldn't last that long. So, but it can be helpful.
A lot of these comments are occurring in that "what can we do" kind of category up there, right? Okay. Anybody else? Well, a couple of things I want you to notice. One is that science and philosophy are not necessarily separate disciplines. Okay, you can blend those silos here. Two, obviously, science can be relevant. Okay, it's not all esoteric, in the lab studying stuff that nobody ever gets to see, kind of thing. Brian, thank you very much. Really appreciate you doing this. Have your annual bonus here. Okay. So thank you very, very much. And thank you, folks, for coming. Okay. I've got people in the back there waving at me saying, tell them to fill out the comment cards, okay, which is a piece that I keep forgetting all the time. So please do that. Okay. And thank you, and we'll see you next month. Okay. Thanks.